All right, we got Mike Lee on the podcast. Mike is the head coach at OPEX. He has some insane number of remote coaching clients who he works with individually, and he's also on the floor pretty much every day working with the OPEX on-site athletes, a bunch of competitive folks, some sponsored folks, names you probably know, Tennil Reed, Amanda Goodman, Megan Benzik, who used to be a coach at South Loop, and one of my clients is out there, as well as Austin O'Neill, who used to coach at South Loop, and folks we've had on the podcast previously. So Mike and I first met doing, I believe, some of the OPEX CCP Level 2 courses together. So we've known each other for a while based upon that, and we have a good conversation. We talk a lot about groups of athletes actually training together in person, which is super interesting. If anyone has been a part of those types of situations, you know that the social dynamics of highly competitive people in one place can get pretty complicated. And having been a part of several regionals teams myself as an athlete and as a coach, I've seen the less pretty side of those types of interpersonal relationships come out often. It's not always the friendly high fives and arms around each other that we see portrayed on Instagram. A lot of it gets pretty messy. So Mike has some good insight into how they actually deal with that on site and how they have these highly competitive athletes all in the same place without tearing each other apart. We also discuss some choice words from Charles Poliquin at an internship that Mike was part of. Some pretty direct statements from Charles to Mike, which are quite funny and worth listening to. And then also just lessons learned from high level athletes like Tennil Reed, Filly, Amanda Goodman, all clients who have worked with Mike and have done well at the CrossFit Games. And honestly, why a lot of those lessons aren't applicable to everyone else, that the people who are good are just pretty good. So check this out to learn more.
Yeah, I think the social dynamic that you mentioned with the athletes and, what's the hierarchy and all the philosophies behind hierarchies and what that creates in terms of people's confidence amongst athletes, how it's created, all that stuff is quite, it's been an interesting learning experience for me more than anything, because I've never been in that atmosphere with that many athletes. I'm going into answering the question, but
sure.
I thought that was an interesting point just because it's been something new to me that I've been able or privy to now see, which a lot of people don't have that ability, is to see how it all meshes and comes together, and how the alphas are created, essentially, and how it works throughout the season.
Well, I mean, I think that anything like that is, you have some theories surrounding how it works, and then when you put personalities in a closed space together, just stuff starts to come out. You're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's
and
interesting.
You learn about people.
Yeah.
I think that's the ultimate, been my ultimate learning, is just watching people and understanding, so much more about behaviors and what athletes truly need to be successful in terms of communication. And it's becoming more and more apparent that the programming is, yes, it's important in relation to what they need to do and be successful, but there's so many other factors that come up, and now I've seen, that have to be in place, or the program it really doesn't matter what it is. It can be anything.
It's reps and sets, right?
Right.
They can do any number of reps and sets, but that's not always what makes them tick. Well, since we already started talking about it, what's the what's the deal? How many athletes are training together at OPEX? What is their history? Who are they? They're famous people who some folks might know. Give us the rundown.
Yeah, cool, man. Let me go through this. We have six athletes on site, and we'll call them sponsored athletes. Austin O'Neill, Megan Benzik, Rachel Campbell, Jake Berman, Tennil Reed, Amanda Goodman, Colleen Fosh. So a pretty diverse group in terms of their backgrounds and athletic history. Oddly enough, when you watch some of them move, you can really pick out who the athletes were and who the CrossFitters were, right? In the differences between the athletes that walk in the door, like the swagger and how they walk, and you can just see it on their faces, versus the CrossFitter, which is, you can pick those people out too, and it's very easy. So a lot of diversity in their background, some athletes, some not, but we felt like in bringing this group together, we had a good balance between all of the different areas. We felt like, bringing these group of people together, we could try to see and help them reach their actual potential. And that was the philosophy in bringing some different younger versus older versus more experienced versus less experienced the more and more of that dynamic, I think, creates an environment for people to really figure out who they are, who they can be as an athlete.
Yeah, sure. So you got all these folks together and sort of like we touched on, like pretty much immediately, right? In any social situation, you start to see almost like dominance hierarchies emerge, right? Like the way that people relate to each other, all that sort of stuff. So, I mean, once you brought these folks together, which would have been, when did they start? It would have been maybe end of last summer, something like that?
Yeah, it would have been like August for the most part. I think some of them got here a little bit after that, but most of them like in sometime in August or towards the end of August.
Yeah. So what was that process like? Just mixing and matching all these folks and sort of seeing what comes out of it.
Yeah, up front, you know how it goes. You come into the gym, they kind of all look at each other like, what are you going to put on the bar? How is this going to how are you warming up? Like, what are you doing? And then, you know, you got a jokester, someone like Tennil, who's just been in the game for a really long time, who like breaks the ice with like this uncomfortable, awkward comment like, man, this is going to be an interesting year, or something like that. And that kind of allowed, and I think the environment that James and I wanted is that kind of environment. It was a serious one, so they pushed as athletes, but also one that like we knew there was going to be some dominance in there, and I'll call it the alphas. And I think it shapes and molds over time in relation to people's success, which is pretty consistent in what I see in most hierarchies across the board. You usually have a lot of very successful people at the top. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, because their direction, if it's a positive one, can also bring everyone else up to another level. So I think that's kind of what got created. Obviously, Tennil came off with a very successful season. So everyone kind of like, you know, we started to mesh and started to look to her to try to see, you know, what she was going to do, right, and where she was going to push. And I think that ultimately created this atmosphere that everyone was trying to just one up each other, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It creates a good competitive atmosphere. But at the end of the day, the support for one another and back and forth is always there. And I think that was ultimately what I saw created is yes, there was a hierarchy, but there was also this breath of fresh air, because they felt like they were in the right environment. I think that really clicked for all of them when they got here. Yeah,
sure. So if you look at, you know, like you mentioned, that competitive atmosphere and potential effort to one up each other, that's something that is very powerful, but you probably have to be really careful with how that is actually executed on a daily basis, right? I mean, you know, as we've discussed in the past surrounding like good training principles, right? It's like, cool, you don't want to end up killing yourself on the floor after every workout. You don't want every heavy single on a back squat to be a grinding 1 rep max, right? You don't want every, you know, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off assault bike workout to, you know, have people, you know, seeing God. And it's like, okay, cool. If you have someone who you're trying to chase, then that can put you there in a way that isn't necessarily ideal. So how do you manage that with this group that is competitive?
Yeah, for sure. And I think once we started to see the one up, it's conversations both James and I had about them being bought into one upping themselves, right? So the one up philosophy, it's like, okay, it's great that you're better than, or you did better than this person, but actually you could have done better as an individual. So you get them bought into their own potential and start to tell their own story, and that's eventually the leading factor in why they're doing, you know, what they're doing. So I think that's one thing I really picked out from this group is really, really asking them each, you know, what specifically they're in it for. You know, why are you doing this? Are you in it just to one up someone? Are you in it just to beat someone in a CrossFit workout? Or is there a bigger story that you're trying to create and be successful in terms of your potential, in terms of your, you know, athlete story? All those things come into play. So I think the tough questions in the conversations surrounding like what exactly they want to do in the future with this thing, and being bought into not just Instagram, and being bought into, you know, not just these sponsorships they get for protein bars and, you know, RP. It's like, who gives a shit, to be honest, right? It's like, who cares at the end of the day? At the end of the day, if you're in it for the right reasons, you're going to be successful. And that's one-upping your own self over and over again. And whatever that potential is at the end of the season, and that's where you finish, and that's what you deserved. And there's nothing more that I would proudly support if a person actually does that and gives everything they have.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's tough to get people to zoom out from that stuff, right? That it's really easy to get caught up in the results of a specific training session or trying to post a certain video of a lift on Instagram, and to actually zoom out and see the big picture in the abstract, it's easy when you're having a conversation or talking about it, away from the actual training environment. But when you're in it, it's much harder. So I mean, what does that look like? Are you just like, yo, cut it out? Or is it kind of like
Yeah, you got to nip it in the butt right away, right? And you know that, or it festers and it stirs up and it convolutes the environment that everyone else is trying to be successful in. And granted, shit happens, so it's not like everything is perfect on the floor and everyone's having a great day and there wasn't tears or screams or arguments in the gym. That shit happens, and that's the reality of having a bunch of really competitive athletes in the same environment. They're fighting for the same spot, so it's going to happen. So it wasn't something that we avoided. I think a lot of that allowed the dynamic to improve over time, because then there was transparency and conversation, communication. It wasn't like there was things that were hidden, right? And there wasn't things that people were resenting. It's like, well, you went out there and put everything forth. Don't worry about what anyone else does. Just go out and do what you need to do. And so it's little talks and execution. It's an education piece. Like, well, this is what I want you to learn and what you did, and here's how you're going to progress moving forward. So then it's more of an experience, and they get something from it, and they can improve. Less of like this, oh, fuck, you did it wrong again. Like, go take a lap. It's not an old school philosophy. We're really trying to teach these people to be better people, first and foremost, and really improve as athletes in conjunction.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, take a lap. The old gym class.
Or like just the screaming and yelling. One of my buddies posted or sent this Instagram message to me today, and he was like, this coach that was screaming at these 12-year-old boys and just cursing up a storm and just like nailing these kids. And these kids looked like deathly scared. And I'm just like, man, I don't see how this is going to make these people better long term. And I know there's a lot of coaches that have had that philosophy and been successful. I'm not seeing it in the cultural development of a sport like this, that so many things can go wrong, where that kind of mentality, the nonstop hammering, is going to be successful for anyone to connect with.
Yeah, I mean, I think the CrossFit athlete is under so much stress as it is. The last thing they need is another stress from a coach just screaming at them. Well, I mean, to your point, looking back at my my upbringing in soccer, right? Like, the stuff that was said to me is like an 11-year-old boy on a soccer team. I'm like, this is insane. Who were these people?
For sure.
Why would they do this?
Yeah. Like I played water polo, on my entire career, in middle school and then into high school and then in university. And I got like the ball thrown at my head all the time, like just boom, like pay attention. Like that was just what they did. Now, like you probably get arrested and go to jail for 20 years for doing something like that. Just the evolution, right? What we felt and what coaches, said to and did to us, it was just completely different than what it is now. And I think there is some magic in that kind of hard-nosed philosophy. I just, read Nick Saban's autobiography, which is a good book. But he's very, very hard like that. And it comes from his evolution of his father. And I just think back and I never had that. And I just bring that experience forward because my dad was always super supportive and wanted me to succeed. And so I carried that as to like how to connect to people and help them move forward, and not necessarily that like, hard ass mentality.
Yeah, I read Bill Walsh's book, and
good one.
Yeah, he talks about just like purposefully losing his mind like once or twice per season, right? And it's like not even like he's actually that mad. He's just like, they need to know that I'm sort of a maniac, so I'll just like freak out occasionally just to let them know that it's in me, but that that's not really an effective way to actually coach. Yeah, for sure. Although I don't know if that's going to work with a group of females either. Yeah, there's potentially some personalities that may not react well to the Bobby Knight. Yeah, even males. Throw a chair around. Just females, right? There's a lot of feminine males that would just get torched by something like that. They would like be hard nosed up front and go home and cry. And be like, oh, this is not okay. Well, something you mentioned a little bit ago that I thought was interesting is that you're dealing with a group of athletes who are essentially fighting for the same spots in a zero-sum game, right? Like every spot that someone takes to go to regionals is a spot that someone else doesn't take. Every spot that someone takes to go to the CrossFit Games is a spot that someone else doesn't take. And sure, in an ideal world, right, all of your female athletes just all qualify, and they're all like, "Oh, cool, that was great! Like, good job, everyone." But that, you know, that may not be the reality of the situation. So, how do you keep that sort of like, you know, I mean, I don't know what the right word is, maybe pettiness from popping up, where people are trying to undercut each other rather than focusing on their own progression?
Yeah, I think that it came back to the decision of the people that we selected to come out here. And I think if you have good people, they're all in it for the right reasons. And if you're honestly looking at it in this entire picture and saying, okay, how can I sabotage someone else's score so I get ahead of them, win points, et cetera, to where I really felt like the dynamic in the gym was always like, how can I do this best? And if my best was, you know, going to get me to qualify or will put me in the CrossFit Games, then it will. But we have a pretty good dynamic in terms of the communication between athletes. A lot of them we have some different personalities. So some people are more quiet and not a little bit soft spoken. So maybe they need more confidence. And I feel like a lot of the athletes that we have help build that confidence in support of those other individuals that may not have as much of that oomph and that athletic spirit for them to be successful in competition. So this will be my first season with them, obviously going to the regional and trying to feel that out in terms of like, you know, getting them all to warm up at the same time and then getting them all into their heats, et cetera, which it could, you know, blow up. But I just don't feel it in relation to what we saw in the Open, which was a competitive environment, but an environment where everyone was pushing themselves as individuals to exceed their potential. And, you know, ultimately we're relatively successful because a number of them qualified and we're taking a fairly massive group to the regionals. And then, you know, lastly, I think people really know where they sit on the pecking order in terms of performance. It's not unwritten by now where people sit. I think that also creates some clarity for people like, okay, well, I know that I need to do my best and stop worrying about like what the individual next to me is doing, because that's when you get into the gray zone of, you know, like you said, just doing way too many reps or trying to one up that person when you know realistically you don't sit in that realm in terms of performance. So I think it's honesty about where people actually sit, and then telling them this is exactly what's going to happen and this is how you're going to go about the entire or the Open or the regionals. And then that creates, you know, a good experience, which ultimately, if we do that for all of our athletes and they give full effort, then I'm happy at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that the ability to see where you truly sit in CrossFit is much more confusing than in a lot of other sports for people. And that actually training with other people who are just legitimately better than you, I think can sort of clarify that, right? Because in CrossFit, like let's compare it to, say, track and field. Right. If you're a 400 meter runner, like, you know what your best time is relative to someone else's time. And like, it's just clear, like, okay, cool, that person is just faster than me, right? And there may be a few people who, depending on the day and depending on the race, that you're clustered together and that you're competing with them. But I see more people have extreme confusion about where they could realistically finish in a CrossFit style event, because they're comparing their 1 rep max and their max unbroken set of muscle ups to someone else. And they're like, I'm better than you. It's like, actually, no, you're not. Like, that person could do literally everything else better than you, than those two things. But through some psychological trick, you've convinced yourself that you're on their level.
That's the matter, right?
Yeah, that you're on their level because you can clean more than them and do more muscle ups than them, but they'll just beat you on literally all other stuff. So I think that in-person dynamic of just like seeing, oh, whoa, Tennil did that. Okay, like maybe I'm not there.
Yeah. No, well, the reality is she did well. So if she was not successful, she's just like some person competing in the sport. It's like, well, she got 6th at the CrossFit Games. So you take a look at that and say, okay, well, is her level the top? Well, no, I don't think it is. I think there's obviously people that beat her. And there's obviously areas where she showed, you know, the areas that she showed that she needs major improvements in. And she's not the best in the gym at. There's definitely some areas. But the reality is, as you take those top scores, you can start to create some, at least some ideas or some strategies and some estimations on the test and say, okay, we pulled 100 people or 400 people, which we've done in the past with these group of tests, which give indications, in relation to how good you'll be at the sport. Now, how accurate those are, well, it's fairly good, right? So, max muscle ups, oddly enough that you say that, is one of those tests. It shows a great indication for successful components for people in the open. But there's so much else out there, right? And we talked about that, and psychologically, like what's going on in their brains, physiology, where they're at, in the month, and if there's just so much that is outside of their physical abilities that happen to allow them to sit at peak performance. And I think that's where CrossFit is so complex. There's so many different fatigue mechanisms that come from all these different areas that we look at a couple tests, and of course we say those are indicators of success, but we can't truly identify those things because there's 15 other things happening outside of the gym that need to be perfect for that to take place and for them to be successful.
Yeah, and then depending on, even on a day-to-day basis, the same test will have a different fatigue mechanism for an athlete, right, based upon who knows what factors.
Yeah.
It's like, today my forearms blew up. 1 week later, do the exact same thing, same time of day, same rest day the day before. Oh, my low back blew up today. Oh, I don't know.
Yeah. Like, wait, what? Right? And that's why I like track. It's like the 400 to 400. Like, okay, there's different types of track, and I get like there's definitely some indoor versus outdoor. Like there's some play and like what the scores will show. But CrossFit, the tests are never consistent. The reality is the tests are never consistent. But even to this day, we're still developing like how we look at everything and piece it all together. So I think that people just say like, oh, I've got this equation to make people better at CrossFit. I think it's bullshit. It's like there's a lot of ways to climb a mountain. Now, are some ways more efficient? Well, I don't know, maybe. But I think there's a lot of different things that come into that fatigue model, or those fatigue mechanisms that you have to take a look at when you're trying to make someone successful in the sport. There's too many systems out there that slap something on and say, oh, this is how you get better because this person is good. And it's not taking a look at the whole individual, which ultimately will progress them in the future in the long run.
Yeah, I think that we've talked about this before too, where some people who are good are going to be good pretty much no matter what happens. Yep. So whatever the system the best are using is probably not what you should be using, because they're just freaks, and kind of no matter what they do, they'll be good.
Yeah. Like, just look at Matt Frazier, for example. Like, he's unreal. Like, that guy is a freak. You watch him move, you watch his ability to just understand pacing and how his body is working through a workout. Like, it's magic. It really is. It's really fun to watch him execute something really well, because you're like, man, that is how it's done. But Matt can do anything. In my eyes, he just has to train lots and do lots of everything, and he'll continue to improve and continue to get better. And just correlates to what you mentioned. There's too much focus and questions asked about, what's Matt Frazier doing? And it's like, arguably, first off, you wouldn't be able to handle what Matt Frazier is actually doing, right? For real, like in his training. And the people that try to do it will last, up to a couple weeks. And then all of a sudden they recognize and realize that resilience in those individuals is massively more than any of us regular folk standing on the sidewalk.
Yeah, that's very real, right? That simply the ability to even survive the training regimen of many of the elite athletes in the sport is just outside the capacity of 99% of individuals who would even dare to do so.
Yeah. And the games is like 1% of people. I'm like, man, just focus. Like, it's like you're 700 in the open, and all of a sudden you're talking about, okay, what program am I going to get to go to the CrossFit games? Like, well, you got to look at what program is going to jump you 200 spots in the open first, my friend, not the CrossFit games. That's like, what I said. I don't know what the total, the math comes out to be, but I just say it's the 1%ers, right? It's the 1% of all the males and females CrossFit in the world are at the CrossFit games, and that's a unique group. And arguably a lot of that group could be doing lots of anything and everything, and do lots of anything and everything currently in their training in order to improve. In my eyes, and what's worked for me in the past with a lot of high-level athletes, is that exact philosophy is all you're doing is looking at nervous system and then just adding and adding a little bit more and then adding a little bit more. And as soon as you start to see these indications where it's like up and down, bam, you drop it down a little bit and then you go back up. And what do? Well, you just keep adding. And that's resilience. Ultimately, the successful individuals in the competition have enough volume to recover in between all the intense hits throughout 13, 14, 15, 16 workouts at the games. And they're resilient enough to handle the volume of training.
Yeah, so based upon that, I think something that any coach of higher level athletes is thinking about probably has to do with bouncing back and forth, sort of like you mentioned, between, what is the maximum tolerable dose that these individuals can take of training, and then what is the minimum effective dose necessary to actually get them to progress, right? And that it's like you kind of want to play with both of those concepts in training for someone who does want to compete at regionals or the games. So how do you think about those pieces with your higher level athletes?
Yeah, especially in the off season. And Todd, you brought up a great point, because there's too many people that are trying to build volume 3 weeks out of competition, right? There's unique scenarios and cases. Say, for instance, an individual that is a shoe-in for regionals, right? And they know they're going to get through the open, and maybe their progression through the open is actually their training. You're training through the open to get to the competition, and their peak's going to be at regionals. But there's too many individuals when I look at programs that are all out there that there's a shit ton of volume done, too close to the competition season. So it's what you said, in the minimum effective dose is what's required, and it has to be the right dose. So we'll call it intensity, or we'll call it the sport of CrossFit, that needs to be done in an effective dose closer to competition. But individuals in reality don't see it as that. They're trying to add and do all these different, workouts and build training volume up to the open. And it's too late in the season for them to accumulate that many reps in relation to their ability to recover fast enough for the competition season. So that's a great point in terms of the minimum effective dose, because more and more I see it is there's a lot of individuals that need less training after they've done the volume over the course of years. So they've been training 4 or 5 years at a very high level and a massive amount of volume. All of a sudden, it shifts to the minimum dose and the right intensity that's prescribed, and consistency of the athlete that essentially, makes them jump and has massive improvements for them, in whatever the competition is.
Yeah, so you can play with those minimum effective dose concepts relative to how much volume they've been doing, and potentially see major spikes in their overall ability if you sort of time it right, and probably end up with a little lock on the back end surrounding, what that individual is experiencing. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we're guessing. So it's like, well, fuck, I hope that's enough, but we don't know. So you're absolutely right. And something you brought up there was good. It was like, okay, like in the philosophy of like building reps closer to a competition season, there's so much emphasis now put on looking at the previous competition workouts and saying, okay, have we accumulated enough reps for the individual to be successful in the competition? And if you're looking at that, a month out of competition and you don't know where the individual sits in repetitions, you're already way too late in what they have needed and acquired in total volume to progress. And I think as coaches, there has to be a bigger understanding of what's the requirements of the competition that the individual is going into, and then track back and actually periodize. Like you mentioned, these ups and downs. Well, fuck, it's called a plan. Like if you have a plan and you periodize appropriately, then they are these waves where you're doing a lot of volume, and then you're prescribing a minimal effective dose to prescribe a different dose response to the individual so they can adapt. And if they adapt faster in the sport of CrossFit, then they're going to be more successful in the competition.
Yeah, sure. So to give like a tangible example of that, let's pick something for the open. So, I think that, you can do the rep math and be like, okay, cool. At some point in the open, you're probably going to have to do 150 wall balls in a workout, and you're probably going to have to do that twice. So you're probably going to have to do 300 wall balls in 4 days.
5 days. Yeah.
Right. So,
4 days. Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
Cool. Like that's easy to think about. So take that number. Then when are you thinking about making sure that athlete is adapted to that type of volume over that time frame?
We'll use the open as the example. So January, they've got to have it by January, because in February, not the open, the date shifts a little bit. We'll call it the end of February or the beginning of March, one of the two. So that gives about 8 weeks of development of what I'll call an intensification phase or a pre-comp to competition phase, where they're doing more of sport-related specific workouts, which still can build volume and total repetitions, but it's more skill acquisition and practicing the skills under a fatigue setting. And I think that's the difference is volume and accumulation. You're not doing things, necessarily under fatigue, maybe some, but not a ton. You're trying to do a massive amount of reps to be able to handle the intensity that's required in the competition. So I look at something like wall balls. In general, if you look at 300 reps, so people say, okay, so I have to do 150 reps on one day and 150 reps, on a Tuesday and a Saturday. Well, that's where you have to get creative with the design, which it's like, okay, well, just think of the reps as what they are. It's like, well, can a dumbbell thruster be similar to a wall ball? Well, no, it's not the exact same dose response. No, it's not the same muscle recruitment. I get all that, but we're still doing a squatting and upper pushing movement. So I still look at those things and say, okay, can I accumulate enough leg endurance in squatting for the individual to do 300 reps and be able to, or 150 on a Friday and then 150 on a Monday in total volume? That's like, okay, yeah, no problem. And good athletes will look at something like that and say, yeah, I could do 300 reps, no problem.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I want to circle back to some of the group dynamics, because there's a question that I had that we didn't really touch on, which has to do with say you're in this group of competitive athletes, which is awesome in terms of like pushing you and making you aware of like what can be done and seeing what the best of the best do. But there's also for some folks can be like a real psychological trauma to just getting beat badly every single day, right? And we've seen that at South Loop this year with one of our athletes who sort of has come on strong and qualified for regionals individually this year.
Nice.
And she got really good really fast, and to suddenly just be like smacking people in the gym is like not always psychologically easy for someone who is used to being one of the better athletes. How do you, I guess, communicate surrounding that, or teach folks to handle that that aspect of just getting wiped on the floor? Yeah, exactly.
That's a challenging one, because it's something that it's hard to teach. Now, if you look at athletes that have lost in competitions, that have experience in competitions and losing, they come back and understand that it can just be a learning, and they can evolve from it and improve. So they're down a little bit, but they realize and recognize that things go on, and they can still, they have opportunity to still improve, and they can still, come back and give full force. So it's the difference between the individuals that have done it versus the individuals that haven't done it, which is, a lot of people in CrossFit just never had too much of an athletic background. So when they get their ass kicked and kind of are laying on the floor afterward, like kind of questioning why they do it, I sometimes just allow them to be in that space. I think we're really quick as coaches to go try to solve problems for clients, right? And for athletes where you're like, okay, let's talk about it, instead of just allowing like it to just settle a little bit and then going ask them a simple question. Well, how'd that feel? Or what were your thoughts in that? So trying to just turn it in not a negative light from the coach. Because as soon as they see like, you're like, what were you doing? I can't believe you did that. Like, that's not what we talked about, right? And that pushes them so far away to where that process for them to actually come back takes a massive amount more time. So my philosophy is to allow them to sit in it for a second, because I think you can't fix it right away, nor can you fix it altogether. And then ask a simple clarifying question that allows the individual just to communicate back to you and give their insight, right? And kind of sit with them in it is what I like to say. You give them a slap on the back and say, great effort. I appreciate that you went for it. And that's it. And leave it at that. Because the evolution and learning from that is massive versus, the opposite, which is coddling and saying like, oh, you did it okay, don't worry about it. This is, it won't happen that much. Like, and trying to just be the nice guy. I'm just not a fan of that.
Yeah. I mean, and that's also, people can tell it's disingenuous, right? It's like the reality is that you might just get beat badly on literally every single workout you do for the rest of your life. And that's fine. Like, maybe you signed up for that. It's okay.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like, but then we go back to the original point. I was like, well, why do you do it? if you get beat badly every single time and you sit in this like depression mode on the floor and like questioning, you know, the reason why you're at the gym, it's like, well, why are you doing it then? Why are you competing? There has to be something that's greater than that. And usually you can get down to the root of it where people are finally opening up and saying like, this is a bigger story for me. This is where it comes from. You know, I had this experience when I was younger and you know, I got, you know, this coach was brutal to me, and I've always think about that, or it was a parent that said this to him after a game that they lost, right? It's so deep, and if you can get to that point, you can have those conversations, then you develop just a great trust in the relationship, and they understand that you appreciate their effort, and if that's known between the coach and the athlete, I think the athlete feels great about it regardless, and they recognize that, you know, it's one event or it's one workout, and they got lots left.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You're kind of, you know, walking this line there in terms of almost questioning them Socratically to get them to have some sort of insight surrounding like what their experience has been rather than being prescriptive with it. And then you're also sort of trying to stay away from any type of like whatever, I think you said coddling as a word, which I like that, yeah. You know, that's disingenuous and people can tell.
Oh no, it's like, it's the people that like after workout, like I give like fist pumps and I'll give a quick hug and like I'm proud of you. That was great effort. But it's like the big hugs and like, oh my gosh, you did so great. Like I believe in rewarding effort. And I learned this from Charles Poliquin. He's big on this, right? He believes in rewarding effort. Not placement, not what you did and anything else. But if you gave full effort, then there's nothing better for a coach. And that's what I always try to remind athletes. As long as you go out there and give it everything, I'm going to be super satisfied wherever you finish. But the coddling environment, I think, just creates that it's like there's a lot of theories out there like, okay, you're constantly like wanting that. It's like they ring the bell, right? And you're there and you're like, okay, where's my coach going to give me a big hug? And like, okay, he's going to be so proud of me. And then when that doesn't happen, all of a sudden there's like this weird attitude and weird environment that's created. We're like, whoa, I didn't get the big hug and the smile and the pickup. So I think ultimately it's the fine line that you have to tiptoe back and forth on, giving them enough understanding that you're there for them and you want to support them through this entire process. But that's what you're there for, support and rewarding their effort, not to, baby them and make sure that they, get through their day.
Yeah. I think we've touched on basically two ends of the pendulum there, right? It's not helpful to be the maniac who's out there like screaming and like kicking the wall and throwing shit around the gym, nor is it helpful to be, the one who's jumping up and down and freaking out and like super excited and, always positive all the time. That it's a much more reserved, more reserved than people probably think in terms of what it actually looks like to be coaching people in a way that helps them out.
Yeah. And that's the difference between what I would consider a coach, Todd, someone that's actually, interested in improving the athlete versus, a clock starter or whatever else. I don't know what you even call a non-coach, but someone that's a babysitter or a cheerleader, right? There's a very big difference between the two. And I think, coaches are in it for the right reasons themselves. And if the athlete feels that, then they know the coach is there to support them in everything that they're doing. But they're not there to wipe their butts, right? It's like you're there to execute, and you're going to do this well, and I'm going to be there in supporting you through that process. But there's no time for all of those other antics to come to play, and I think that's what convolutes the sport. There's a lot of that emotion and drama around the entire continuum, and that creates this weirdness where people have this expectation of what happens when they come off the floor after a workout. It's where my athletes know what they get, and they perform well. So it's very up to them. And then last point on that, at the end of the day, it's up to them. If they do great and they deserve what they get, then I'm the first person to acknowledge that and say great job. But I'm also the first person to push them towards the cameras and pictures and interviews and all the shit that they deserve. It's like, well, yeah, go do that. That's what you deserve. You gave everything you had. You represented me as a coach extremely well, and I want nothing else. I think that's the misconception. A lot of coaches want their name in the media and they're like, behind the person and putting up their brand and saying, hey, look at me. But it's just so less about that. And I think if coaches are in it for that reason, they're in it for the wrong reason.
Yeah, I think that the almost the social signaling aspect of coaching, not just the branding and getting excited when your athlete does well, but a lot of the behaviors that you mentioned, I see this at competitions of coaches sort of freaking out and being highly emotional or like doing like a lot of weird stuff too, like in the warm up area. We're like, what the hell are you doing? Like, what is this warm up routine that you seem to have discovered, like that you're trying to apply probably for the first time right now? That I think a lot of that stuff is people almost like they're like, okay, what should a coach do? And they're acting as if they are a coach and have these like this checklist of behaviors. Where like, I think you do this, and they're just sort of like checking them off. It's really strange, actually.
Yeah, no, agreed. And you see that so much, and that's why you can really differentiate the people that are experienced and are doing this because they truly want the athletes to be successful. It's like you see like these. The elevation mass pre-events.
Sure.
I'm like, man, I'm just like, I know the science behind it, and I've researched it a lot, and I'm like, man, I do not understand it. But it's just like those kinds of new things I don't quite get. And it seems to be more and more prevalent because systems or whoever the individuals are have to sell something sexy, so they get athletes or whatever it is. And I'm like, well, and the other thing is athletes aren't smart enough, their fitness IQs aren't high enough to understand that they don't need those things. So they're like, okay, this coach of mine who's led me up to this point is telling me I should do these things prior to the competition. And sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I cannot even believe that is happening prior to this next event. Like doing like full workouts before, I'm like, I don't understand that.
Yeah. Good luck to you, sir.
Yeah. All right.
Well, I think a lot of that stuff, it's, the tactical edge is just so appealing and people sort of can't help but jump on it. If it's like, oh, well, if I do this, then I'll potentially get this edge in the competition. If you think that the elevation mask, for example, is going to somehow activate this breathing pattern that's going to give you this whatever percent edge. And, we've seen the regionals come down to points. You're like, well, why wouldn't I do it? It's you can sort of understand that line of reasoning, but I think the overall aspect of it becomes borderline ridiculous when you see what actually comes out of people sort of following those behaviors.
Yeah. You watch them and then they get last. And I'm like, what the fuck are you doing? Yeah. And I agree that there's definitely small edges that people do, but I think you see it more and more, the separation of that group of individuals and the group of people that are there, that have a plan, that have the right execution of the coach in place, setting them up for success. You have this separation. It may not be like that day one or day two, but day three, you see those top 10 individuals really pull away. And the rest of the field, that really is guesswork, right? That's all they're doing is saying, I hope this works and I hope the training worked up to this point. I think you really see the separation at that time because the third day, especially this year's regionals in relation to the amount of volume that's in currently, people will either have enough training or not. That fifth workout, the chipper, is no joke. And watching it and just being around it, I just can tell you that's a challenging workout. And then to finish with, some relatively challenging thrusters and rope climb at a fairly high pace, more knee flexion, it's going to be challenging for folks. So if you're not ready for that, I truly think we're going to see a massive separation after that point.
Yeah, that'll be very interesting. I mean, we talked about this a little bit before I think we actually started recording, but the 3 miles on the assault runner, the potentially 55 heavyish deadlifts, provided you can get through the bench press, the 100 whatever pistols, if people can get through the handstand walking, that's gonna take a toll. Yeah,
it's no joke this year in terms of the reps. An interesting comparison to last year, which I felt was relatively light in total volume. So it's been an interesting shift this year.
We'll see what happens. So you mentioned a name with the initial CP, Charles Poliquin.
Oh, yeah.
So did you intern with Charles? What's the deal?
Yeah, twice.
Yes. Tell me about that.
Oh man. If you ever meet Charles or get the honor to meet Charles, he's unreal in terms of his thoughts and philosophies in strength and conditioning, especially strength work. Arguably, I haven't learned from everyone in the strength world, but he's definitely on the forefront and what I would consider one of the best individuals in the world at what he does. So it's challenging because he really makes you learn, and he's not hesitant to use choice words very quickly to tell you that you're not doing it correctly or you're not smart enough, essentially, and you need to get better. And those choice words are they vary, but they're nothing that if you aren't ready to handle it, then you just might as well not be involved with Charles because you won't last a day. So I will say, Todd, that one thing I learned from him a ton is just how sexy the simplicity of design can be, and how much you can get out of such simple movements that have been done for years and years and years, and just changing up some of the different rep schemes and tempos, et cetera. So I think he's a magician at that. So if I can say one thing that I took from working with him in the past and continue to work with him in the future, it's that his ability to take a very complex sport and simplify it a ton in terms of how he sees that person getting better or improving. He's a master at. So that was fascinating. And the other thing is he's so much knowledge in his brain in terms of research and everything that's been done in terms of his mentors and who he's worked with all throughout the world. It's like gold. I can't say anything else. You get so much information, you're blown away. But what I like about Charles is he makes you apply it and learn how to apply it. You don't leave there like, okay, that was great information, but I have no clue how I'm going to take this and put it into my athletes' prescriptions.
So did you go and work with him on site somewhere?
He came here. And there was a facility that it was local, so he came here and we worked with him. It was 5 days worth, and in the classroom setting as well, in the gym setting. Just variations of sports. One of them was a sports-specific internship where we bring up different sports, we work through different training philosophies and ideas for different sports, how to test them, how to progress them, how to make them more powerful or whatever it may be in relation to what they need for what the sport is. And then we go to the classroom, and that's, it's challenging, man. It's a lot of work and a lot of information. And you have to be able to keep up. If not, you can pay a lot of money and not get much out of it.
Sounds like he may have had some choice words for you. What did you do to upset him?
I'll tell a great story. I'll tell you a great story. And this is just being completely transparent because I laugh to this day. Michael Bam was there with me. I was at his advanced program design course, and I was it was James, oddly enough, texting me about something, and I picked my phone up to text James back, and he goes, "Hey, you fuck, get off your phone." And I was like, like just stone cold, like, oh man, I just got ripped apart, and I just put my phone down. He goes, "No more of that shit the entire course, you fucking out." And I'm like, got it. And that was the end of it, right? But I'll always remember that and can appreciate it for him because he requires that kind of attention to detail and focus in his courses. So that was my funny story. Michael Band's sitting next to me with his head down, like, dude, what are you doing? It's just, we laughed about it to this day. It's fucking great.
Yeah, I mean that's I wouldn't mind using that series of words myself sometimes to people. I mean, especially during training, like, "Hey, you fuck, put your phone down. What are you doing?"
I know. It is Charles, so he can do whatever he wants. But I'd probably get a lawsuit and get fired. But but. In the essence, he really wants his coaches to be successful. I can appreciate that about him as well. He's touched a lot of people, and his new website, the Dojo of Strength, is a fantastic membership site. He has great content, and he's a master. I don't know what else to say, man. He really is just so unique in how he is able to do what he does. I'll continue learning from him. It's been a great mentor of mine and someone that I have gotten a lot from in relation to how I look at the sport.
There you go. So another question I had for you is how you continue to learn, right? I mean, obviously, folks like Charles have a lot to teach, sort of about strength and conditioning in general. But I mean, as we sort of talked about, we're dealing with a sport that is relatively young, that there aren't necessarily experts in the traditional sense, because everyone is still learning, and the sort of ceiling of performance is changing every single year, where people every year do stuff where you're like, oh, huh. Didn't know that humans were going to do that. Okay. Yeah. That's pretty cool. Where do we go from here? So what does that continued learning look like for you?
Yeah, for sure. I think just in relation to the sport, you brought up such a great point, because the sport is so dynamic in nature. You have to look at the characteristics of the sport and then say, okay, how can I improve those characteristics, in my own program design? Because there's no roadmap that's like, this is the only way to do it. It's not in place. Like, you can't say that there's one way to get this person good at the sport of CrossFit, and if that's their aspiration and goal. So is there creative ways, though, to do different things and different ideas to improve certain characteristics, strength, speed, absolute strength, gymnastics, strict gymnastics, all these areas? Now we have these multiple modalities that all need to improve. And I think that's where the creativity lies for the coach. And that's where I learn a ton from, because I'm allowing myself to see what is the specific characteristic, hamstring strength, whatever it is, or endurance in their hamstrings. And I'm like, okay, well, what can I do that I have this plethora of access to all these pieces of equipment and all these movements to make those things better? And I think that's the missing link. Too many people are trying to provide this specific roadmap, and they're not looking at it as this big idea of like, there's so many of these characteristics. You can do a lot of different things to improve them. It's not a science setting. It's not like, it's not a research setting that this is going to equal this and we're going to get this outcome. I'll use med ball tossing as an example. Like, people say, okay, well, there's certain reasons why you do rotational med ball work. Well, there's also ways that I look at it. It's like, well, yeah, it's great core stability and teach you to rotate through the hip, but it's also good glute activation and teach hip extension. There's so many other ways that are more simple form of more advanced movements. Say you're trying to teach someone how to, extend. You're trying to teach people how to use their bum. It's like, why not? Why can't we use and pull from all these different areas of strength and conditioning and bring it all together to improve people in fitness? So I know that was a long-winded answer, but experimentation and understanding what happens in the gym and watching a lot is one of the areas that I learn a ton from. I do sit next door to what I would consider one of the best minds in fitness, in James Fitzgerald. That has helped me a ton, just trying to see the bigger picture and being okay with failure and being creative in my own essence of the design. I read a ton, and then the last one is I take one course every single month. Whether that be a 3-hour course or an extended work course, I try to do at least one course that allows me to continue to push my threshold of what's possible. And Grace, there's no course about CrossFit, oddly enough, yet. We hope to change that soon. But there's nothing that's like, okay, this is what you need to think about when you're developing a CrossFit athlete. So that's the spiel on education. There
you go. Just a ton of information intake, and then just filtering it through real life experience. Sounds like a great plan.
Yeah, and dude, you know this, but you got to be coaching people. You got to be manipulating movement. You got to know how people move. You got to watch people do metabolic work. And I forgot one major piece is I move every day. I train. I have people that I communicate and work with for training. It's James, and I've great conversations with Michael Fitzgerald about it. So there's lots of people that are influences in my life that we go back and forth and have these philosophies, whether it be the internet and I see what they're posting, I'm like, that's really interesting. Or they see mine and they shoot me a text like, hey, why'd you do this? What does this look like? That area is massively important. I think too many coaches are, being the okay with just not doing anything and all of a sudden thinking that they're going to understand what they're prescribing. I think you got to ask backwards, because you have no clue what the dose is if you're not feeling it.
Yeah, that's real. That it's difficult to, even if the weights are different or the RPMs on the assault bike are different compared to some of the higher level folks, you at least have an understanding of what it feels like to potentially do some of those pieces.
Yeah, man. And once you do, and we may not, you may, I'm sure as shit not competing with anyone in my gym at a high level, right? But it's the difference in just me understanding, how toes to bar and box jumps feel together. And you got to do that stuff, especially in progression of the sport. It's like, well, what do you know? Have you ever done a actual bodybuilding day where you get anabolic and you feel huge and you stare at your muscles and you feel good about that, right? And then the opposite is like, have you ever just done mat work, and have you ever done 60 minutes of interval training? Like it's such a forgotten art. I think so many people did it back in the day, and that's how they learned a lot from coaching. You look at some of the greats out there; they all did what they are preaching, and I can appreciate that about James, and I have a lot of respect for him in that. And I've learned a lot about my own self and what I can do as a coach. Also, just how to prescribe exercise.
So something that I'm always sort of playing with is the level of specificity required for someone in CrossFit, right? Where the sport itself is so dynamic, as you mentioned, it has so many moving pieces and so many different things that need to be trained. And that, the amount of volume required for someone to potentially do well in the sport is very high. So having a lot of, accessory work or ancillary types of movements can be very beneficial to keep them training without just doing, butterfly chest to bar pull-ups and double unders every day. But that if you don't do butterfly chest to bar pull-ups and double unders, you're going to have a hard time doing butterfly chest to bar pull-ups and double unders. So how do you think about that balance of, incorporating things that are not traditional quote unquote CrossFit for the CrossFit athlete?
Yeah, for sure. I think, you have to understand phasing and periodization of what a CrossFit season for the individual should look like. And of course, I'll say that it's always based on what the individual needs, because, different people may sit in accumulation, which is more bodybuilding based for a longer period of time in relation to what they need to be in preparation for the competition. But now with the evolution of the number of reps that's required for the open and the challenges with changes in regions, that's now made a lot of things more competitive. Individuals have to be prepared for CrossFit essentially for the open for the most part. So with that said, I think you have to look at how you blend and understand. Well, first off, let me just say that you have to understand what you're doing with bodybuilding in relation to how you're contracting the muscle and what you're trying to get out of it. Because people don't understand reps and sets that are required for hypertrophy, functional hypertrophy, relative, absolute strength, and nervous system development. So if you go on that continuum, and they're not perfect, but we have to just know where the person sits within that to be able to then prescribe, I'll call functional bodybuilding, but just any other strength training exercises that are outside of CrossFit, the sport, and the major movements in CrossFit. So if you know that, then you're able to prescribe the right reps and sets and the right exercises that are going to allow the person to improve. I'll just use a client that's, because you know her really well, is Megan Benzik. And it's someone that we took a long time to really work on and improve her upper back stamina and strength. So an individual like her has to spend more time doing body work, positional work, and getting her consistent in understanding how to activate those muscles before she moves back into dynamic repetitions. And honestly, a lot of times it's a risk, because there's probably no perfect time where you should transition this individual, because she could probably still use a whole other year, as well as calling Fosh, of just our body absolute strength development, and getting her muscles and tendons to be able to adapt and adjust to the repetitions that are required over time. And how you do that, it's time under tension, it's great strength training, it's positional work, it's all those things. Now, in relation to what we have up to the season, it's like we can't do that too long. So I think per individual it varies in terms of what's when you make that transition. But for the most part, what we try to do is say, okay, does this person have a substantial amount of volume built in the off season? And if they do, they can probably stay in that bodybuilding phase fairly long. But in big picture is you have to time it right. The individual has to have a substantial amount of volume if you want to keep someone in bodybuilding or a bodybuilding phase longer. And if you don't, there's potential troubles, because they're going to get to the CrossFit Open and then look at 150 chest to bar pull-ups and not have enough training built.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That the the CrossFit Open is sort of like the in-season aspect, right? And that, if you look at any other sport, say a soccer player or a football player or what have you, they don't necessarily play their sport year round.
Right.
But that, when it's time for them to play, they actually have to play. And that if you're not playing, then you're not used to whatever and CrossFit, the volume of contractions and all that kind of stuff. And maybe a field sport is just the speed of the game and the vision on the field, where you might have all the capacities and the skills there, but if you're just not used to it and you step out there and you're not ready, you're just like, whoa, what's going on? Like, I can't tell where anyone is. Like, I feel a step slow, all that sort of stuff. So similar mindset there potentially.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be lying to say that I don't give people CrossFit prior to the competition of CrossFit. It's like, you have to, because the contractions are the same, right? The nerves are the same. You got to get people geared up to do these like intense workouts for 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, 18 minutes. So I think that's where that preparation goes. But in reality, not enough people take a long enough time off after the season. That's so many individuals just go right back into training. Smart people, and now you're seeing a lot of higher level athletes are competing less and less. Now, you used to see really high level athletes at all these competition, and now they're like going team, right? Having some fun and hanging out on the competition weekend. But the reality is they all understand and recognize that they need to put their efforts into one big competition if they want to make it back. And usually that's the regionals for most folks. So I think it's becoming more and more prevalent that those bodybuilding phases, off season, are becoming more and more accepted by the community because it feels great. You feel healthy. It's opposite of the contractions that you do in the sport, which is important for nervous system repair and recovery, amongst a lot of other things. I tell people, do things opposite of CrossFit when you're in a deload period. That doesn't mean not train. You can still move, but play racquetball, swim, play basketball. You can do a pump session. After that, do some gymnastics progression and planche progressions and stall bar progressions. Like, there's so much out there that we forget about that's so important for body awareness and coordination. That's not CrossFit, but it allows that brain and body to come back to really build something special the following year.
Yeah, that the aspects of CrossFit that are sport specific are not necessarily the same things that are appropriate for that general level of fitness, that you can then layer that CrossFit specific fitness on top of. Right.
Correct. And believe me, it's very challenging to do. And, I have a client and an athlete that everyone knows, Marcus Filly, and we had some success with a transitional period that we went through where we started to blend the functional bodybuilding aspect and blend that into intensity. But you got to remember that the reason and the creativeness in my head was specifically to take Marcus from an injury state, build him back, get his nervous system healthy again, right? Which is exactly what I just mentioned. You allow the adaptations to take place, but Marcus had the volume already obtained. Right. So he went through functional bodybuilding and was able to transition relatively easy into a CrossFit phase because he had the training built. And then he was successful, obviously, at the CrossFit Games and had a great season. But that takes 5-6 years of training under his belt, of doing dynamic reps to be able to go into a season like that, allow some time off away from those reps, allow recovery, and then to build really, really fast and up when he needed to.
Yeah, his body has been there many times. So
exactly.
it's he has a certain level of genetic talent to be able to even get to the position that he was in, and he'd been there several times. So it's not the same thing for him to take a long off season, longer than ideal, and then ramp right back into it compared to someone else.
Yeah, great point, Todd. I think, too, we talk about innate genetic potential for a lot of people, and they get frustrated when they come to the gym. They're like, why am I not better? I'm like, because you can barely squat below parallel, and your femurs are longer than me, and I'm 6 inches taller than you. So it's just some people aren't built for the sport. It's hard to tell people that, and the reality is it's the truth. We know the body type for a male and a female that's going to be successful in CrossFit. They look very similar in nature. They have very similar weights and heights and lengths of torso and femur and good ankle mobility, all these things. And And I think that's for some people, it's really hard to understand, is that they have to take 3 years to retrain a simple position like an overhead squat. And if they're not willing to do that and repattern movement, as you know, it's so fucking hard to do, and teaching people that have a bad pattern to retrain a new pattern. People get just discouraged, and that's unfortunate, because it can be magical over time if they're willing to put in the time and energy that it takes. But most people aren't, so they fizzle out, or they find somewhere else to go try and see if they can give them the magic pill. But it rarely works.
Yeah. Speaking of genetic potential, which is kind of a I don't know, almost a taboo subject in a lot of areas, right? That people just think they can work hard and get whatever they want. Right? It's like, no, don't you understand? I want it. I want to go to the CrossFit Games. Like, yeah, okay, that's cool.
Cool. Thumbs up, right?
Yeah. No, I want it so badly. Like, right. I just want it. So what kind of, I guess, trajectory do you expect to see people on if they do want to make it from an example you had earlier, let's say 700th in the open to going to regionals? If they do want to make it from being, a perennial regionals contender to actually being in the fight to go to the games, what does that improvement trajectory look like?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you that I'm much more interested in the program or the coach that gets someone from 700th to qualifying for the regional, versus someone that has a CrossFit Games athlete that comes on board and just qualifies for the CrossFit Games again. I know the notoriety isn't there, and I have Games athletes that have made it multiple times, so I'm not taking away from that. But I think that takes a lot of good shit. And I think if you can make someone that better, that trajectory is like 4 years from 700th to qualifying in the top 20, we'll just say 4 to 5 years maybe. And if you do that and that client is bought in, man, that's something that I'll respect a ton. So 700th in the open, without knowing too much about the person, but say they move great, they have a good attitude, they want to do it, they're in it for the right reasons. I think that they have to recognize that they're really far out. So the honest conversation around telling them that and how long it's going to take is the first step. Because if they can get bought into the process and what it's going to take to actually get there, then I think you got yourself a great client and someone that's going to be bought in for a long time. And I have lots of those clients, underneath me that aren't Games athletes that just continue to improve every single year, and that's what they're bought into. They recognize where they sit, and there's no lack of understanding, that they're going to qualify for the Games when they, finished 500th in the Masters qualifier. It's just like, it's just not going to happen. But the other individual that you mentioned, which is the perennial regionals qualifier and making the Games, I think that's really based upon the tests, more so than it is based on the program. Because I think the top 15, there's really anyone that can potentially qualify. So I think that's the difference, is that if the tests come out the right way for the individual, they suit him very well. I think he has a better chance than the other guys, essentially for that specific competition. So, but people that are finishing 30th and whatnot in the regional, I think if you go to the regional the first time, then you got to just be happy that you're there, wave to the crowd, give them a thumbs up, and that's all good, right? People don't do that enough. They don't stay present, and they're just excited to be there. They're just like so focused on, okay, what place am I in? Their leaderboard. I'm like, man, just enjoy it. It's the first time there, and you should be there. But if you're making it time and time again, but never improving in terms of your placing, then that's when I would look at the design or look at, something that you're doing and saying like something's not quite right. If you're not showing improvement and you're not working to get better placing, that's all we really have to show if people are improving.
Yeah, I think that your point about the tests is very important. That, most regions probably have 1 to 4, the top 1 to 4 spots are basically locked up, right? That there's a few folks who are clearly on a different level, but then there's another tier of, 10 to 15 athletes that, okay, cool, we'll see what happens this year with Linda and 3 miles on the assault runner. That's going to be a totally different style of testing compared to last year. So there's going to be some shakeups based upon that.
Yeah, and then last year is like the dumbbell. It's like, well, that definitely screwed a lot of people, like just positionally that couldn't do it. So I think, we have to look at the test as an indication. It's the sport we play in, and it's what we've chose, so we got to deal with it. And I think that the best thing for coaches to be able to do is teach their athletes how to adapt fast. we went through a philosophy here on site now that instead of writing individual designs, they come in and we just give them their training on, what we think they need to do based upon the day. So it's been really great because instead of just having their, Fitbot training every single day, they've just come into the gym, write on the whiteboard and say, go ahead and execute. And that's allowed them really to learn like, okay, I can't prepare. I can't go through it in my head. I just got to grab a barbell. We say like, get it quickly. We're going to get started now. And there's less time of this thinking process. So we're trying to get them to adapt faster because, one of my quotes, adapt or die. If you can't adapt fast as an athlete or as a CrossFitter, then you get into workout that's extended and all of a sudden things don't go your way and everything erupts. Well, fast adapters can change that on the fly and know what they need to do to still be successful.
Yeah, it's not just training like a specific energy system or a movement pattern. It's, the people talk about mental toughness and mental training in a way that I think is not terribly helpful a lot of the time. That your concept, I think, of adaptability is a great way to put it, that people who are mentally resilient in this sport aren't necessarily those who can push themselves harder or suffer more in workouts, right? Like everyone who's good can push themselves hard and suffer. Like there's very few people who are actually lacking in that department. And a lot of them have too much of it, that they instead need to be able to, take input like no reps or like a movement standard that they're not comfortable with, or like a change in the feel of the pull-up bar compared to what they're used to, or it's a men's bar for the women's heat. Like, what are we going to do? Like, well, you're going to figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, you mentioned something that's really great in terms of the concept of mental training and big picture for athletes that aren't preparing week after week after week in their training, for preparation in the competition setting of great reps, understanding, no repping themselves, knowing when their standards aren't met, like those kinds of things teach athletes how to be resilient and how to handle and how to adapt in the competition. I don't think there's any magic, method you can do in meditation that all of a sudden is, you're massively now prepared. In previous, when we've done simulation, that's why we do so many simulation, is so that they understand exactly what the execution needs to feel like for each test. So they come in, they warm up, they go through the reps and sets in their head in terms of what their plan is for the workout, right? And then they execute it. And then they learn from that, and then they'll apply it to the following simulation. So if you do that over and over again, I think it is less about, how strong you are mentally. Of course, when the 3, 2, 1 go happens and there's cameras and lights, everything could change. So it's up to the athlete at that point and how much they're willing to embrace that atmosphere and not change what they've done, the past 4 months in training and preparation.
Yeah, and you see some people who are clearly able to do that. It's no big deal to them, or maybe it even is a big deal, but in a positive way for them to be in, a situation with screaming fans and people beating them and judges and all that sort of stuff. Whereas other folks clearly are just not capable of handling that stimulus in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's when you find out so much. I love the statement. This is when James is like, you find out so much about people when they're under high amounts of stress. You find out everything. Right. All of a sudden stress is on and, eruptions happen all over the place. They start crying on the floor. They yelling at their judge. Like, you just learn so much about people in those scenarios and situations as a coach. And so one thing we try to, distinguish with our athletes and really work with them on is just how to handle those things and how to be good people. I think if you're a good person and you're in it for the right reasons, then long term, you're going to execute the way you're supposed to execute. And I think it's just not taught well. It's more of a show. And when people get that attitude of they just want to be flashy and showy, and then things don't go their way, it creates, a weirdness in the environment. And I think that's when eruptions happen, which is unfortunate because it's embarrassing for them as athletes and for coaches.
And all the fans are like, "Oh, come on, don't do that."
Yeah. Like you just kick a barbell. Are you serious?
Yeah. Don't do that.
It's like, don't do that.
No. That's fine. So Mike, where can people find out what's going on with OPEX? And you have videos where you talk about coaching and there's like cool stuff and you can become a better coach for the CCP. Tell us about it. What's going on?
Yeah, man. I mean, our evolution is to really push forward with the concept that we're just calling personalized fitness. Personalized fitness is to us is the meaning and the evolution of what's next, I think, in the world of fitness. It's personalized coaching, it's personalized fitness prescription, all those things. And that's what we're going to be attached to as OPEX moving forward. I think that's our big push into the future, is just really getting people bought on board that coaches, we are very, very assertive in our efforts to make coaching professional again and make coaches true professionals. And I think if we can make that a mission as a company and make people better at what they do, and in turn have a lot of great athletes out there underneath our banner that are they're showing that they represent us well, represent our coaches well, then I think ultimately OPEX will live on and be very successful in our message moving forward.
It sounds like a really good idea. I think you should do that.
Yeah. But no, you can go to opexfit.com. It's got a lot of great information. Our Instagram, my Instagram is Mike Lee OPEX, but we just got a lot of good educational content, and that's what we believe in is educating people as much as we possibly can with great free content. The more we can get people the exposure that they need to learn a little bit more and to make themselves better at what they're doing, I think that's our passion and drive as a company.
Thanks for listening all the way through. I admire your grit, your persistence, and your perseverance. Since you made it, I have a few favors to ask of you. Go ahead and open up the show notes on whatever podcast player you use. In there, you'll find links to all the resources that were mentioned throughout the show. There's also some links there in which you can leave a review or subscribe to the show. And podcasters are always harping on this because this actually makes a difference in terms of the algorithms that recommend podcasts to new people. So if you do that, it helps more people find the show. And if you head over to toddneef.com, you can sign up to receive most of my thoughts and writing, which really only go out to the email list. A lot of it never makes it to the blog or the podcast. So if you like what I have to say and you want to see some of my recommendations and stuff that I've been checking out, go ahead and subscribe to that email newsletter as well.